welcome Brian Whisenhunt to the podcast.
Thank you.
You are the man behind, literally physically and figuratively behind what's happening. Brian, tell me a little bit about yourself and what's behind you right now.
We're on the porch of the historic Gilcrease home on the campus of Gilcrease Museum. And behind us is the museum's glorious new space that we're in the process of completing for Tulsa community to house the Gilcrease collection.
I love that. We talked a little bit right before we started here about when this was started to be dreamt up. 10 years ago, it sounds like a little bit of that journey. Mm-hmm. Early on, what was that? You had mentioned earlier, it may have been a little bit of a remodel, but then let's get more into the details of that.
Last week was 6 months for me in this job, so I don't know everything about everything. So I position myself as an expert in training now.
I love
it. But my understanding is that initially this project began as a remodel of the existing building, and the previous Gilcrease structure was kind of a Frankenstein of buildings. It was 5 different construction projects from the 1950s into the 80s. And there was a lot of challenges. If you remember it, there were a lot of kind of hallways you went through. It was kind of meandering. It wasn't a very logical visitor journey. So originally the idea was to refresh that space and to improve the quality of the building for the care of the collection. But I think ultimately they decided that all those funds would be invisible to the visitor because they would support things like HVAC, mechanical and engineering, new windows.
Not super sexy.
Not things that change visitor experience. Doesn't change how we share the collection or how people learn about it or enjoy it. So ultimately, it was decided that the old building would be demolished and they would start anew, and those funds would go towards building this beautiful new building that's behind us.
I love it.
And at that moment, I happened to be living in New York, and so of course, following the national press on museums across the country, especially Gilcrease and Philbrook, which are my childhood museums I grew up going to, and I thought, how can they tear down that beautiful building that I remember so fondly from being a kid and just all those spaces and the experiences I had here with my family, with student groups as a young person. And I thought, how can they do that to my beautiful museum? And I came here, I was visiting my parents, and I was like, I'm going to go by, I'm going to see that space one more time before they demolish it. And I came through and I saw it, as an adult, not in my mind's eye, and understood the need to begin again and to really create a building that this collection and this community deserves.
I love that. Great answer. Before we go too far into your personal journey and how you are to be where you are today, for those who don't know very much about the Gilcrease Museum, can you give us a quick synopsis on maybe the land that it's on, some of the history? You mentioned 1950s, and very selfishly for me too, to learn a little bit more, or re-familiarize myself with such a Tulsa gem.
Yes. Gilcrease is celebrating 75 years this year. So the museum has been here supporting the Tulsa communities for 75 years, which is pretty exciting. And it was begun by Thomas Gilcrease, who was a Muskogee Creek citizen, and he became very wealthy because of his allotment as a young person, and through some travel and exposure to what other people were doing with their immense wealth, he decided that he would begin to build a collection and devote that collection to the ideas around the Americas. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand. And even personally, I'm an art historian by training, so I've always approached the Gilcrease collection through the art that's here, and that's how a lot of people know it, our strong collection of Western paintings. But it's so much more than that. The Gilcrease collection is often compared to the Smithsonian or the Met, it's really singular in its makeup and its origins, and it tells an amazing story about the history of the Americas through a variety of different lenses, through different disciplines, art, historical documents, archaeological items. So it really is multidisciplinary in nature and hemispheric in the way that it addresses both North and South American history and culture. It's not just the American West.
Wow, that's a great... I'm already kind of, as you're saying this, I'm like, I remember walking some of these older hallways and seeing a lot of this stuff. How would you rank, and not that personally, let me just state this. As a Tulsan and as a longtime Tulsan, I've always viewed there was, and maybe in the museum world it's a little bit different, but Philbrook and where we are today is like the competition, if you will, like Gilcrease and Philbrook, like striving to get, whether if it's fundraiser dollars or a more beautiful space. Do you guys in the museum world, is it kind of thought that way, or is it more collaborative?
No, I think in nonprofits in the museum world that we think of are the institutions in the business world where you would think of them as a competitor or someone you're striving against. But we use more familiar language in nonprofits and museums. So we would say that Philbrook is a sister museum to Gilcrease. Sure. So it's a little bit more friendly, and we see more family connections. Of course, there's always that competition for fundraising, support for other elements like that. We're both in service to the Tulsa community, and we have complementary collections, and we work really well together. And I think some of the competitive ideas are more from the exterior and the outside world rather than from how the institutions work together. We're planning a joint trip to Bentonville to see an exhibition that both institutions lent objects to in December. So that's going to be both of our member groups who are going together. So we do work really closely together, and I think that that's becoming even more essential in the future.
I love that. Yeah. I love that. Okay, it's time to dive into a little bit of your past.
Sure.
You had mentioned you had grown up here.
I did.
Is this where you were born and raised for the most part? Okay. Early Brian, tell me about family life, how you had said you had visited here as a young adult. Yeah. How has Tulsa impacted you? And what's maybe those early seedlings has then drew you back, it sounds like, as you moved away and then you came back. So love to hear a little bit about your early days.
So whenever I was a kid, I always loved art and making art and looking at art and going to museums. And I think my family is filled with creative people, but they're not necessarily oriented towards arts and culture. They're creative in other ways. Okay. But even so, my parents recognize that interest is important and essential to my character. And so they always encouraged it. So we always came to Gilcrease for events, for family activities, and for Philbrook for classes and all of those things. So they really supported that. And when we traveled, we went to museums because they knew how much I loved going to museums. So I felt like my parents and my grandparents really supported those areas of interest that were important to me. And I don't think that they saw that it was going to be a career or like the entirety of my life or a big part of who I am, but they just wanted it to be supported and to be cared for. So it's like I always saw myself in the art world. I just didn't really know, what that meant. And I think when you're a kid, you have this idea that you're going to be this or that whenever you grow up, but you don't know like what that means or like what the path is to that place or what that work will be like. But I had a really pivotal experience whenever I was about 12 that kind of opened the world of museums and museum work to me. At Philbrook, they were hosting the Arm & Hammer collection, which was part of the Hammer Museum, LA. And this was a coup for Tulsa to have this exhibition. And if you look at the history of it, it was traveling the country and people were literally standing in line outside of museums to get a glimpse of these masterpieces that were part of this collection. And my father's boss was invited to the opening of that exhibition, and he knew through my father how much I loved art and museums, and so he gave the invitation to my dad. And Sam took me to this opening at Philbrook when I was 12 years old, and that was the first time that I went to an art opening. And it was just so different because I've been to these classes and I've been on tours with my school group, but I'd never been to an event that was focused on adults and this experience. And kind of like a light bulb went out and I thought, people work here. And it also happened to be that moment in middle school when we were talking about vocation and how the things that we loved and the parts of our lives that were interesting to us might inform what we did when we grew up. And so these kind of ideas collided in this perfect storm. And I was like, well, I'm going to work at a museum, but I didn't know like what that meant or what I had to do to get there. So it was really that journey of, figuring out what I had to study and what I needed to learn to get on the path to work in a museum.
So that was the first, you had been to museums, but that was the first like, eye-opening experience of like, geez, like what you had said, like people work here and people curate these things.
Yes, it was a completely different exposure because in the past, when I've been, as a child, as a young person, everything's kind of focused on you, like your experience. And so like to walk into this event where there's so much happening, all these people are coming into this amazing space and there's this amazing collection. It just was a different way of seeing museum and understanding the museum experience than I'd ever considered.
It's so funny to kind of like as an adult to walk through an exhibit or walk through space and be like, oh, there's a certain level of maybe understanding that you would like consume something visually and be like, oh, wow, that impacts me in this way or that way. How at 12 years old were you impacted with this? I mean, we're getting into the details here of like, how would you say that impacted you? And I realize you kind of looked around like, oh, this could be a job. But like, as far as that collection, why was that monumental? In your opinion, why that moment? Why then?
It's a good question. I think, again, part of it was just it coincided with the conversation I was having at school about vocation. So I was looking at the world differently at that moment. Like, what does it mean to have a career? Like, these are all the things that we were studying. But at the same time, it just kind of... it opened up the museum experience in a different way for me. I just hadn't seen it as something. Saw it as something for kids because I was a kid. I'd always done these things. I didn't see it as a place for adults. I didn't understand it as adult space.
Oh, really? Okay.
Or job space or vocational space. It was sort of like, oh, like grown-up people come here too. Like not just my teacher, not just my parents when they bring me. Like this is a thing that people do, and I think that was the first moment I really understood that.
Okay.
And kind of grasp it. And I remember I was a little bit of a nerdy kind of bookworm child. I grew up in East Tulsa, and I was talking to someone at lunch today. One of my pastimes was volunteering at the library to shelve books when I was in third grade. So I had kind of peculiar interests as a young person, and I still do as an adult. Yeah. And I think that, for me, having loved art and having loved museums, it just kind of was like a door opened up, and it was like I could see myself in this place and in that space. And I remember going through the exhibition with my dad, and I remember the paintings that we looked at and the conversations that we had, and to this day, and it's like it really just still kind of excites me. So
that's really cool. Yeah. That's really cool. Well, at 12 years old, getting inspired. Yeah. That's pretty remarkable. That's pretty cool. Okay, so that was the start.
Yes.
Give me next couple steps here in the journey. That was like the realization that, hey, this is a thing. This is cool. You mean not only me, but others enjoy this sort of stuff as well. What's the next kind of milestones for you?
Well, I went to the library and started looking there to get an understanding of like what I would have to study and what I would have to learn to pursue a career in museums. And so I learned that one could study art history, that like studying not making art, but how people made art and how it reflected culture and civilizations and communities was something that I could do in college. And so I was like, hey, this is the degree for me. And then I had to convince my parents that it was, something that was actually viable, and it wasn't just, I think there's a lot of jokes about degrees in art history all over the internet, and I have two of them. So it's just sort of
the brunt of everyone's jokes.
Exactly. So I appreciate that. So convincing my parents that yes, this is a degree that will yield an education that will get me a job. Was a long conversation with them, and so I was kind of looking at schools and where I wanted to go, and I actually went to the University of Oklahoma when I was 17 with my grandmother to look at the campus and to look at the school. And I met with someone that's still a very close friend of mine, Susan Bailey. She was the curator of education at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art at OU, and talked to her about like what opportunities were there to learn about working in museums, like what classes I could take, what internships, what work I could do. And she really helped me to understand like what would be available to me at OU. And so that's where I decided to study.
I love that. Yeah. I love that. So you were formally educated, if you will, with just the appreciation of art. And I think this might be a real great follow-up question is, as I kind of dive in here, do you, excuse my ignorance here, maybe a little bit. So
go for it.
I might be asking some really dumb questions.
Go for
here.
it.
So obviously within the world of museum and exhibition and collections and all this stuff, you have old more archaic pieces that have more like it was because of Michelangelo's inspiration on a painting, or it could be, I don't know, any number of things. Do you find that you gravitate more towards more new modern art, or do you gravitate more towards more classic art? And again, I excuse, there's probably lots of like subcategories there that I've completely glossed over, but I'm kind of curious.
I think, I mean, in our history, especially as you progress in your education and your field and your area of expertise becomes more narrow and more narrow. That's just the nature of academia. But I've always had a very freewheeling interest. So for my thesis, I actually wrote on sculptures from the late 60s and early 70s that were done in the American landscape and the Western landscape. So that's what I wrote on. But at the same time, I'm super interested in colonial portraiture, and I love late 19th century neoclassical sculpture, and I love contemporary art. So I think if you talk to anybody that works in museums or is associated with arts and culture, most of them are going to express a kind of freewheeling interest that's always changing. Who's the next artist that you're discovering, whether it's an artist that is contemporary or one that's historic that hasn't gotten the attention that was due. Like an artist I became obsessed with in the Rockwell collection, the last museum I worked at, was Susan Waters. And she was a woman who was painting in the 19th century, which there were not that many women who had access to the education and the resources to have a career during that time period. So I really became obsessed with her story and her work in a way that most people wouldn't imagine. She painted these just amazing painting with these beautiful bovines that she was just obsessed with. And people will tell you I've talked about this painting like ad nauseum, and I just really became obsessed with her story and her work. But at the same time, I'm very excited by contemporary artists and the work that they're doing and what inspires their practice and their studio.
This reminds me that several years ago, and you might be rolling your eyes already, but just hear me out for a second. I got involved with NFTs and the whole NFT movement and crypto and that whole thing. And I was a pretty aggressive collector there for a little while of different people's art, one of ones, this, that, whatever. In the museum world, when that popped off, what was it, it's like 21, 22, when it really got hype. How did you guys address NFTs? Is a lot of the established museum authorities, let's call them, were they very skeptical about that new wave of art? I would call it art. I mean, digital art, obviously it's a little bit different, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, it was interesting. We had a lot of conversation around that. And as far as, like museums acquisitions and how collections are built, it's not one person that's contributing to that. At my last museum, we had a committee and they dealt with the growth of the collection and the plan that we had around growing and expanding the collection. So we had a lot of conversation. Like we were bringing, like every time there was a meeting, someone was like, well, we have to read this article on NFTs. It's like, can we please stop talking about NFTs? And it became like it was the same thing, with Pokemon. Like whenever that happened, like I feel like every museum spent like 6 months just talking about Pokemon, and then like ultimately to no effect. And the NFTs felt a little bit the same as far as like, what does this mean to collections? How do we think about collections? I think personally, I have a much more expansive idea of works of art and the sanctity of the object or the lack of sanctity of the object. So I mentioned that I wrote about earthworks, which are the large-scale sculptures in the American West. And Robert Smithson created one of the most iconic sculptures that's part of that group, and it's Spiral Jetty. And it is a 3/4 mile, 1,500-foot spiral in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And that sculpture exists in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's underwater and you can't see it. Sometimes it's exposed and it's covered in rock crystal. There's a film about it. There's photographs about it. All these things are the object. So for me, the idea of something existing in a digital realm or on paper or in a gallery or in all of these places is not contradictory. And I love that kind of fluidity of material. So it wasn't a challenge to me, but it's a challenge to the collection and how do you care for it and what that means to the rest of the collection when you begin to add a completely new medium, a paradigm shift in how you think about art and what art is.
I would say I had a fair understanding of the appreciation of art. When NFTs came along, I found that, I was a baseball collector as a kid. I was a little too old for the Pokemon craze that came up after that. But I found that I really, with the NFT movement, it made me realize, not only because of the digital movement of whether it was a computer generated, an AI created image, or this, that, whatever, that they determined that this is that putting in these prompts have created this product. But also too is I found that photography specifically, I really started appreciating the love of dynamic photos. And I know that it's so, at least in my mind, I know in the back of my mind, I can just hear people saying, well, anyone with a camera is technically a photographer, or this, that, whatever. But what some people can do with cameras is, and
Even
same
with
thing
your
with paintbrush
iPhone.
or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's, for me, it was more or less, there's artists that are brilliant. And whether it's a paintbrush, whether it's a camera, whatever, they're really painting. And this artist, it's escaping me his name, but he had a collection, an NFT collection called Where My Vans Go, or Where Vans Go, or something like that. And he was a very illegally climbing buildings and climbing structures all around the world. I don't know if you ever heard about this.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, it was pretty crazy.
Yeah, it sounds like
so
it.
It has a little of that adrenaline junkie, which I kind of. Anyways, and he used to take pictures of these gorgeous landscapes on top of these buildings with like his shoes out, like sticking out or whatever. I know that's completely maybe I don't know, hypocritical of what we're talking about, but I found that really amazing. And I guess all that to say, because of that, because of small collections like that, I've really it's broadened my horizons, let's call it, to sculptures, to early paintings, to other things of like, you know what, this is, I don't know. It was just my eureka moment, you know?
And I think, like it or dislike it, to me, the most important takeaway is people are talking about art, and finding a way into it. And, recently there was a little controversy around public sculpture here in Tulsa. And of course, director of the Gilcrease, everyone's like, well, what do you think about this? What are your opinions? How do you feel about this sculpture? And the last person that asked me about it, I was like, it doesn't really matter to me. I said the most interesting thing is that this is eliciting dialogue and conversation about art. That's the most exciting thing to me. And also I'm in a position where I don't have to like everything. I think that's one of the challenges we have around arts and culture, as especially in the United States, is like, well, I don't like that, so therefore it's not valuable. But I don't find myself in that position. I can not like something, and I'm okay with it. It still can be interesting to me. It can still elicit a response or conversation or dialogue. I don't have to like it. And at my last museum, a lot of times people would say, well, I don't like that painting that's in the gallery up there that I saw. And, it's too abstract, or it's too whatever. And I said, you know what? I don't like every painting in this building either. And ultimately, I'm the person that makes the decision on what's in this building, but I'm happy to live with works of art that I don't necessarily like, because of the tension that creates and because of the dialogue it creates with work that I do like. And it allows me to see it differently. So that's the thing I appreciate most about conversations around NFTs or what have you. It's just the fact that people are thinking about art and the way that it impacts how they're seeing the world and how they're seeing themselves and the people around them. And that's ultimately what I want, is for art experiences to do something for visitors, for them to have an experience that changes them in some way and makes our community and our state and the world a better place.
I love it. I love it. Back to a little bit of what you're doing here at Gilcrease. I can't help but think about, like, what if you were to be, as a young Brian, were to be invited into this new space? What really cool aspects of what you guys are building right behind you are you not only excited to share? I'm sure there's maybe more catering to the younger community, but also to the adult community? Like, what exciting things are happening that you're really excited to share with Tulsa?
I think that the approach to our permanent exhibitions and the permanent galleries is going to be different for people because it's going to eliminate some of the segregation that existed before. And it's not just going to be, here's the paintings in one gallery, here's some archaeological objects from the collection in another. It really takes an approach of drawing a line and connecting those stories through time, through space, through geography. So I think that's one of the things I'm very excited about, is that this new iteration of Gilcrease is going to show it for what it is, and not just allow people to kind of get stuck into one discipline like, I was, as far as being stuck in the art story, which is a great story, but there's so much more to it. So that's one of the things I'm excited about. I'm excited about the way that the space will welcome people into the collection and into the galleries in a way that it didn't before, and really improve visitors' experience. And the other thing I'm excited about is just the approach we have to interpretation. We've worked very closely with numerous people in our community, numerous people in our state, around the country, to develop this interpretive plan, to develop how we think about our galleries and about this collection. So I think all of those perspectives are going to be so represented. It's going to feel like a very special moment for Tulsa when Gilcrease opens and they see the numerous contributions that people have made, not just financial contributions to make this building happen, but contributing stories, contributing the perspective. So I think that's what's really going to be special. It's going to represent Tulsa in a way that perhaps it didn't before.
Sure. How often are you walking through? Are you finding are you getting giddy? You're like, I got to go through again because this is changing, that's changing.
Yeah, it's sort of, it was when I first got here 6 months ago, it was every week. And it was changing a little more slowly than it is now. It's in the last stages, so it's really speeding up. So I was gone out of town for a couple of weeks for work, and so I came back and it had been almost a month since I'd been through. I almost didn't recognize it because it's just getting to that point of the carpeting and the tile, all the finished part that is happening a little more quickly than pouring concrete and building foundations. Right. You can't really see that change as quickly. So it's exciting to go through, especially with other people. I've been through a couple times with folks who hadn't seen it. I had the opportunity to go through with Chief Standing Bear from Osage Nation a couple of weeks ago, and he hadn't seen it in several years. Wow. And so he just was blown away, and it was really great to get his perspective and to see his reaction.
That's really cool. All right, we're going to bounce around here a little bit. You had mentioned you worked in New York.
Yes.
So talk to me about your New York experience, not maybe only in the art scene, but why were you there?
Yeah.
Why did you end up going to New York? And obviously this pulling you back from New York, but give me more about your New York experience.
Yeah, I haven't lived in Tulsa for 30 years or Oklahoma for 25. So I've been moving around the country, working at different museums. And my last position was in upstate New York in Corning. And it's not a part of the world that I really knew much about before going. And I actually looked at that job. I was at a moment in my career where I was sort of like, do I stay where I am and keep on going with the next chapter, or do I move on to something else? So I was kind of looking at what was open, and I saw the Rockwell Museum in Corning, New York. And I was like, well, I can't live there. This is like the middle of nowhere. It's the town is 30,000 people, so it felt very small, but it's a very special place, and it's a very different place. And I got after I decided not to apply for the job, I got a call from the recruiter, and you, of course, always take those calls. And so I had the conversation. And by the time I finished the conversation, I was like, well, maybe I can live there. And it's going to sound weird to say, but upstate New York's a lot like Oklahoma as far as the geography. There's a little bit more change in elevation. They have a lot of natural lakes and waterfalls. But as far as feeling very rural, some of the parts of eastern Oklahoma with our hills and the verdancy of our state, it felt very familiar. So I really responded to that. But it was different. It was a different place to live, and really appreciated the opportunities there, especially access to New York City and being there for exhibitions and meetings and galleries and the relationships that I developed. So, yeah. And
now that that's kind of unearthing a little bit, you were going, in the past 30 years of leaving Oklahoma, you were following museum jobs all across the country. Where were some of those? How many? And then what were some of the special ones?
Sure. This is the 6th museum that I've worked at in the 7 7th position that I've held in a museum and the 4th museum that I've led. So I started in Wichita, Kansas, and then from there I went to Austin, Texas, where I was a part of the team that opened the Blanson at the University of Texas.
Yeah.
And they let me work there even though I went to OU. As long as I didn't talk about it, as long as I kept quiet.
Just don't say it.
Like, you know, when you're calling somebody on the UT campus, they answer hook 'em, and you just like have to bite your lip, you know? So that was really special. It was a great opportunity, and I think that experience, I really loved being on campus. Is one of the reasons I was drawn to this experience, and Gilcrease's connection with TU is that multidisciplinary mix. And I love putting the chocolate in the peanut butter and the peanut butter in the chocolate and just mixing it all up. So working at the Blanson was a really great opportunity to experiment with disciplines and different perspectives on art and exhibitions. So I love that. From there, I went to Indiana and was at the Swope Art Museum, and that was my first position as director. And then I was recruited to go to West Texas and was in Midland, and then from there to New York. So just like zigzagging around. But they finally asked me back. You know, it's I was at one point telling someone, you know, it's like I've lived and worked all over the country, and you know, I'm living in Texas. Like, where are you from in Texas? And it's like, I'm not, you know, it's like, I'm an Okie in exile, and like someday they're going to ask me back. And I was kind of going to give up hope, you know, it's been 30 years, but they finally invited me back. So
at what point in time did you ever have your crosshairs on the Gilcrease or Philbrook or any of these museums back
I
in
didn't.
Oklahoma?
I mean, it was always like an idea, but it was like like the timing never kind of felt correct. So this all aligned in a way that felt really good. So my parents still live here. They live in Owasso, and my brother and his family relocated a couple of years before the pandemic. So it just kind of felt like it was all, you know, coming together and falling into place. And you know, being here at this moment and building this new building for a museum that's so important to me and has been my whole life, it just feels so special. So, and it's an amazing team of people to work with on this project.
So you had left Tulsa and you were gone, you said, for 30 years, close to 30 years or so.
Yeah.
And you moved around the country. I don't know how often you were coming back home. Let's assume you didn't come back home.
Yeah.
How has Tulsa changed? What's amazing about Tulsa? What does Tulsa still need to improve on? Let's talk Tulsa for a little bit. Yeah, let's talk about Tulsa. I love this city that I'm from.
Yeah.
I love, obviously, lots of aspects, but there's some things that we definitely need some improvement.
Yeah.
What are you most excited about when you 6 months ago when you came back? Like, what are you really excited about?
I think there's just this amazing, creative group of folks that are just doing so many cool things. I feel like there's so much to do in Tulsa. It's unbelievable. I can't keep up personally between like my work schedule. It's like trying to find time to do the things that I want to do. It's been really exciting to explore. And I think, you know, growing up in Tulsa, I loved living here, and I felt like there were so many amazing resources and so many great cultural institutions. And I think Philbrook, Gilcrease, the opera, the ballet, all these things have been here for so long. And I believe that they're so foundational to what's happening now. I don't think what is happening now could happen without this so solid foundation of cultural institutions and philanthropy and support of community that knows what that does and what that means for a city to have those resources. So it's so cool to see all of this vibrancy, all of these new ideas that are coming out of that. And I feel like growing out of that historic foundation of cultural institutions that have been supported and have been seen as essential. So that was like one of the things that's like very cool. And like my parents, as I said, they live in Owasso. So when I would come visit, I really wouldn't come into Tulsa that much. Like their life is centered there. So it was really, you know, around what they were doing and like their community. I would come in for like lunch with a friend. So I see a glimpse like, you know, at this area or this place. Sure. But it's really cool. It's fun to see. I think sometimes, you know, it's like hard to go to the spaces that are so different than when you were growing up, because I loved Cherry Street as a young person. Whenever I got my driver's license and I had agency to go and do what I wanted, that was one of the places I frequented. I loved all the used bookstores and the t-shirt shops and the things like that used to be there. And I still see some of that in Tulsa. It just doesn't, it's not as concentrated in the way it used to be in some of the places like Cherry Street in Brookside. So like, where's that edgy part allowed to grow and to blossom and to be kind of away from kind of the main part of Tulsa culture. So
Chalks is still there, by the way.
yes, it is, and I go there a lot. And I don't love Cherry. I still love Cherry Street. Don't come for me. Don't come for me, Cherry Street. Yeah, I still love Cherry Street. Absolutely, I love what it is, but it's like I can't help but see some of like what was there.
Yeah, it's funny because growing up here as well, you see a lot of the more historical pieces, but then you have this modern element that's kind of risen up as well. And you're like, that's not how I remember it.
Sure.
But it still has like the bones of Kilkenny's and some of those great classic spots that
absolutely
you remember.
It's still there. I mean, I think the spirit's still there. It's just hard sometimes whenever, like you love a place or a space and it becomes so different than like what you remember. But I think Tulsa's an amazing place to be. And I think it's just what's happened the last, I don't know, few years doesn't seem right. What's been happening here for a very long time is really paying dividends. And I think
I couldn't agree with you more. You had mentioned a lot of that foundation of I think you had mentioned the Tulsa Performing Arts, the TA, and all the shows. Dude, Randy, what's his last name? Randy with the attractions, is U.S. Attractions or something like that. They bring in the shows into the Tulsa Performing Arts Center. And anyways, Tulsa is ranking in a lot of these bigger shows is quite high for the size of our city. And after speaking with them, he was basically saying that these shows, even though our population might not be the size of some of these bigger cities, our love of the arts is there here in Tulsa. And he was just saying we're able to pull some of these a lot bigger shows because of that. So
yeah, I can really see, even after being away for so long, how essential these organizations are to the community still, and how the additions like Gathering Place, like what's happening on Riverside, like what's happening downtown, have become essential to the contemporary citizens of Tulsa. And that's my hope, that when Gilcrease opens, that that we step into that essential area of people's lives, and that they want to be here for a variety of reasons, whether it's a program or event or activity, to check out a new exhibition. We are working on hike and bike trails that will be west of the museum.
I love that.
A lot of different ideas that will help people connect their own interests to those of the museum. So I hope that we become a part of that essential category for Tulsa.
And just through my perspective, I feel like Gilcrease was kind of always there, but I feel like now during construction, it's kind of went into a lull of like, we know it's happening, but it's kind of like back of mind things. Whereas I think that pendulum is going to start to swing up to where it's going to be top of mind.
Yeah.
It's amazing what they're doing out there, and I know I'm really excited personally.
Everyone keeps asking, when are we opening? What's happening? So,
Well, that was going to be my closing
that's
thought.
The class.
So let's
you're not
wait.
ready to close?
I have a couple
Okay.
more. I have a couple
Okay.
more before we get there.
We can
we're headed
save
that
it.
direction.
We can save it.
Exactly. What would you say to an aspiring artist? I know these are more cliche type of things, but being in the museum world, you've probably seen a lot from a lot of these, not only artists that are well established, but maybe up and coming. What are some tidbits that you could say that you've seen, or that you've at least heard stories of said artists that hey, any kind of advice for early artists that are wanting to come up and maybe eventually have their art in museum?
I think the last 50 years of art and museum exhibitions, and this is like broad summary, but ideas and concept have become more and more essential. And now we find ourselves in this time where we have AI, and the creation of images, objects is so much easier, maybe, question mark. So I think this world of ideas has become so much more public. So whenever you are thinking about what you produce, technique is amazing, and there are so many people that are so skilled, but you also have to think of concepts and idea, and how it relates to the current time, how it relates to artists and art history that precedes you, how it may impact and be seen in the future. So I think you're really thinking about how your concept and the ideas that you're bringing to your work inform it, and it's not secondary. It needs to really be primary.
I really feel like with artists specifically, it's all about the story.
Right.
So you have to have an impactful, you don't have to, but it seems that the ones that break through, at least, that a little bit more mainstream, there's a big element of storyline there that they're like, oh, wow, that's really cool. Or they went through X,
Absolutely.
Y, Z to get to where they are today.
And I think there's so many different ways to be an artist, and you have to decide what that means for you. I think that's true for any type of career. Where do you want that career to be? How do you want it to be connected? So sure, you can be an artist and have an amazing life and go to art fairs and sell to people who are just putting it in their suburban home. Or you can be an artist that's showing at MoMA. Those are very different things, and those
Sure.
worlds don't necessarily overlap. So I think intention is something we often don't think about, and it's something I've been asked to speak to a lot of student groups. I was at OU last week and talked to some of the students there, and it was like, what advice would you give? What would you share? And it's like, well, think about who you are as a person and what career path and position aligns with that. It's something we don't really talk about. Like, what's your personality? Like, how does that connect to the work you'll be asked to do in your job? And also think about what you want that career to look like. I don't have children, so I've been able to make decisions about my career and take an opportunity that didn't involve taking Sally out of third grade elementary school and impacting her life and making her unhappy. So it's like, I've had that luxury. My life is different than perhaps some people. So you have to think about your own life and the decisions that you'll make and what that will mean for your, not just your quality of life, but what your life is like, and bring some attention to that. So I don't know that I really knew enough as a young person, and I don't know that advice is necessarily heard or heeded, but it's sort of like, think about it. And luckily, I think I made the right decisions, even though they weren't always done with intention.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. As we wrap up here, first of all, I really truly believe you're very creative. I'm getting some creative vibes 100%.
Good.
If you were to say there's one outlet, we're talking about different outlets, being creative, what would you say you really enjoy doing that you feel like your creative outlet is X, because could be maybe childhood things or even recent days type things. I found this, and this is what I really like to do. I would love to hear your personal.
Yeah, I think I'm an artist, and I still make art. My output is a little challenged sometimes based on my other, professional obligations. I would say my primary creative output currently is cooking. And
I love this. Okay.
I love to cook, and I was raised in a house where we were expected to know the basics of how to care for ourselves and not allow someone else to be obligated to care for us.
I love that.
And then both my grandmothers were amazing cooks, so I inherited like a love of the kitchen from them. And for me, it's like, even I've had like a rough day and 8 million meetings, which is basically every day. I can get home, go into the kitchen, and it doesn't stress me out. I know a lot of people find cooking to be stressful. That I don't find it that way. So when I talk about cooking with some folks, they're like, it's the worst. Like, I never want to cook. Like, we order out all the time. But for me, it's not stressful.
Yeah.
And I can leave all of the meetings and all the conversations behind and really just basically zen out in the kitchen. And I think the beautiful thing about cooking is usually is preparing food for someone else, so you're getting to share what you've done, and it's a creative activity you get to enjoy right then and there, and can be a source of conversation, a source of nourishment, a source of dialogue and connection. So it's really
what's your go-to dish that you're just like,
oh gosh,
obsessed
it
with
always
right now?
changes. Like, I am like perpetually like collecting different ideas and recipes. I'm trying to think. There's nothing. It's like it's been rough.
Give me a genre then, at least, that you
Oh
love
my
to
God.
play.
I love Korean right now, so doing lots
Really?
of Korean
Okay.
flavors.
Okay.
And the farmers market. We love the Tulsa farmers market. So a lot of times inspiration comes from what's there. You know, like where do you start? So I've been very active getting to the market when I can. So I'm trying to think what else. We went to the Pan Asian supermarket that is there at
on the East Tulsa.
Yeah, 71st and Mingo.
Yes.
And they just have an amazing array of ingredients across Asian cultures, across the Asian subcontinent. And it was really inspiring. So I went home and just got out all the Asian cookbooks. So I've been pouring over those, some Korean, some Chinese, some Vietnamese. So, yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I think what everyone's been waiting for. Exactly. We're here. Here we are. From the exterior, it looks amazing.
Right.
When are we opening? Why are we opening then? What can we anticipate with some of the collections? Maybe tease us a little bit on
this is the question on everyone's lips. Everyone I've met in Tulsa, when is this happening? We waited so long, and unfortunately we're going to be waiting a little longer because the building is almost done and it looks amazing. Everyone's going to be so impressed, but it's a sequence of events. So once the building is done, it does have to cure for a period before we can begin to move artwork into it, just because of the delicate nature of parts of our collection. And then a lot of people are aware that the Gilcrease collection is over 350,000 objects. So that's going to take a little time to move back into the building and to rehouse in the new storage areas. So that's all going to begin happening the middle of next year. And then in 2026, we'll begin mid-year probably to do some soft opening events and some donor events and open in late 26. Which seems very far off, but for the Gilcrease team, it's going to be here before you know it.
That's almost at the end of the road compared to that 10 year,
I know,
that 10-year thing.
But we have a plan to assuage some of the disappointment in this delayed opening. So next year, starting in May, we're going to do 6 months of community programming. So the building will be done, and we didn't want to miss the opportunity to introduce Tulsa to this beautiful new space for Gilcrease collection. So we'll be announcing the details of it soon, but it's going to run May through November. We'll be doing a couple of different days of programming each month, and we're going to be inviting our community to actually contribute to that programming.
Love that.
So it's going to be a community-driven project and have a lot of different components, a lot of different ideas, and hopefully feature a lot of our sister institutions bringing their audiences and their performances and their ideas into Gilcrease space. And the idea is we didn't want to delay, and we wanted people to see what everyone's been working so hard on for so long, what the city has worked so hard on, what our donors have contributed to, what the Gilcrease team has worked hard on. We want them to see this space and appreciate it for what it is before we move the collection in, before we get into true operations, and to really enjoy it and to feel welcome and to feel ownership of it, because ultimately this building and this space and this museum is Tulsa's museum.
I love that. And I love that there's a little bit of a sneak peek aspect of it to wet everyone's whistle before it.
Stay tuned.
I love it. I love it.
There's a lot to unpack there. So.
May through November.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Be expecting it, people.
Absolutely.
Brian, it's been a great conversation. Anything last that we covered a lot of different things.
We did.
We
Thanks
jumped
so
around
much.
a little bit.
I appreciate all
Thank
your
you so
questions.
much for sitting down with me, and
absolutely
so excited about not only yourself and your new position, but obviously the museum, and you guys are on to do very amazing things. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome.